The HR director told the CEO that the head of people development had resisted the succession planning initiative and had not produced a framework adequate to support it. She said the delay in the company's talent pipeline was attributable to a failure of strategic thinking in my function. 7 months earlier, I had submitted a complete talent development framework, 62 pages, scoped precisely to succession planning, to the HR director for implementation. She had shelved it. A copy had gone to the CEO's document repository as part of the standard executive briefing cycle. My name is Bronwyn. I had spent 10 years in people development, the last 4 as head of people development for a national insurance group based in Auckland, New Zealand. The group provided life, health and general insurance products across the New Zealand and Pacific markets, with a workforce of approximately 2,000 people across its operating entities. My function was responsible for the capability frameworks, development programs, and talent processes that supported the group's people strategy, including, centrally, the identification and preparation of internal talent for leadership progression. My HR director was a woman named Constance. She had led the HR function for 5 years and occupied the position of strategic HR leader, with both the CEO's confidence and the executive committee's ear on people matters. She was skilled at the executive communication that shaped how people decisions were perceived at the senior level, and she had a consistent pattern with strategic work produced by the functions beneath her. She received it, characterized it to the executive as work in progress or insufficiently developed, and either delayed its implementation indefinitely or reframed it as her own initiative when it eventually moved forward. The succession planning context had been building for 2 years. The group had identified, through board-level workforce planning, that a significant proportion of its senior leadership cohort was within 5 to 7 years of retirement, and that the internal talent pipeline was not sufficiently developed to fill those roles from within. The CEO had commissioned a people strategy response. Constance had been charged with leading it. She had tasked my function with developing the talent development framework that would underpin the succession pipeline. I had delivered that framework 7 months before the conversation that produced the CEO's call to me. The framework was 62 pages. It covered talent identification criteria, development pathway design for 3 career stage cohorts, leadership capability benchmarks aligned to the group's strategic priorities, mentoring and sponsorship program architecture, and a 3-year implementation roadmap with defined milestones and resourcing requirements. It was specific, evidence-based, and directly scoped to the succession planning need the board had identified. I had submitted it to Constance on a Thursday. I had also submitted it, as part of the executive briefing cycle that my function participated in monthly, to the CEO's document repository the same week. That cycle existed specifically to ensure the CEO had visibility of significant functional work, regardless of how it was characterized in the management layer between us. Constance had told me the framework needed further development and that she would revert with feedback. She had not reverted. 7 months later, she had told the CEO the framework did not exist. I learned what Constance had said to the CEO through the CEO himself. He called me on a Wednesday morning and told me directly, in the careful and measured way of someone who has heard something that does not sit right and wants to understand the full picture before forming a view. He told me the HR director had briefed him that the succession planning initiative had been impeded by the people development function's inability to produce a viable framework, and that the talent pipeline gap the board had identified was attributable in part to this failure. He said he was calling me because he wanted to hear my account before any further decisions were made. I told him I had submitted a talent development framework 7 months earlier, scoped specifically to the succession planning need, and that it had been submitted to Constance for implementation and had received no substantive response. I told him it had also been submitted to the Executive Briefing Repository the same week as part of my function's standard monthly cycle. There was a pause. Then he told me he would look in the repository and call me back. He called back 23 minutes later. He had found the framework. He had opened it. He asked me to come in that afternoon. The meeting was attended by the CEO and the group's Chief People Officer, a role that sat above Constance in the organisational structure and reported directly to the CEO. I had not been told the Chief People Officer would be present. I found, when I arrived, that the CEO had already briefed her on the repository document and had asked her to attend. I brought a complete file, the framework in its full 62-page form, the submission record showing the date it had been sent to Constance, the executive briefing cycle confirmation showing its inclusion in the repository, and a brief timeline I had prepared showing the 7-month gap between submission and the current conversation. I had organised all of it in the 3 hours between the CEO's second call and my arrival at the meeting. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 10 minutes. The CEO and the Chief People Officer had both read significant portions of the framework before I arrived. The CEO told me he had read the executive summary and the implementation roadmap in full, and the Chief People Officer had reviewed the talent identification criteria and development pathway sections. The CEO asked me to walk through the framework's development, what had informed it, how it addressed the specific succession planning need the board had identified, and what implementation would require in terms of timeline and resourcing. I did so from the document, working through the major sections in sequence. The Chief People Officer asked detailed questions about the development pathway design, engaging with the substance rather than the process. I answered every question from the document where the document was specific enough, and provided context where the written content required elaboration. After approximately 45 minutes of framework review, the CEO asked me a direct question. Had I received any substantive feedback from Constance on the framework in the 7 months since submission, and had I followed up on its status? I told him I had sent 2 written follow-ups to Constance in the months after submission, one at 8 weeks and one at 4 months, asking about the feedback and implementation timeline. Both had received brief responses indicating the framework was under review. I had not followed up again after the 4-month mark because the absence of feedback had begun to read less like delay and more like a decision not to proceed, and I had not yet identified an appropriate way to escalate without creating direct conflict with Constance. I told him this honestly, including the part where I had not escalated further. It was the one point in the sequence where my practice had been incomplete. I had not used the executive briefing channel to draw attention to the shelved framework, even though the channel existed, and I was already using it for submission purposes. The CEO heard that clearly. He noted it without elaborating on it. The Chief People Officer moved the conversation forward. She asked one question that told me she had already drawn a conclusion and was confirming its basis. Had I, at any point, communicated to Constance or to anyone else that I did not support the succession planning initiative or did not believe a talent development framework was necessary? I told her I had not. The framework I had produced was the product of 8 months of development work. It was not the work of someone who did not support the initiative. The CEO asked me to leave the framework copy with him and return to the office. He said he would be in contact by the end of the week. He contacted me on Friday afternoon. He told me the Chief People Officer had conducted a review of the HR function's handling of the framework submission over the preceding days, and that the review had confirmed the sequence I had described: submission, receipt, 2 follow-ups, and no substantive engagement or implementation action. The review had also found no documentation in the HR functions records suggesting the framework had been assessed, discussed with other stakeholders, or formally deferred with a stated reason. He told me 2 decisions had been made. The first was that the talent development framework would proceed to implementation immediately, with a steering group convened to oversee the 3-year roadmap. I would lead the implementation, with a direct reporting line to the Chief People Officer for the program's duration, rather than through the HR Director function. The second was that Constance's oversight of people development strategy was being removed, effective the same day, as part of a governance restructuring of the HR function's responsibilities. The restructuring was described internally as a realignment of strategic and operational HR responsibilities. The substance was that the function responsible for suppressing and misrepresenting strategic work had been separated from the oversight of that work. Constance remained in the organisation for a period, in a reduced capacity. The specifics were not shared with me, and I did not seek them. What I was told was relevant to the work. The succession planning program was funded. The steering group was being constituted, and the implementation timeline from the framework's roadmap had been adopted as the program's governing schedule. The CEO told me one more thing before the call ended. He said that the executive briefing repository had been designed specifically to give him visibility of significant functional work that might not reach him through the management layer, and that the framework's presence in the repository had been what made the situation resolvable as quickly as it had been. He said he intended to review the repository's content more regularly going forward. I thanked him and ended the call. The succession planning program launched formally 6 weeks after the CEO's Friday call. The steering group met for the first time the following month. The 3-year implementation roadmap from the framework is the program's governing document, adopted without material change. I want to examine 2 specific decisions that shaped the outcome. One that I had made as a matter of professional practice, and one that I acknowledged in the CEO meeting as a gap. The decision that made resolution possible was the practice of submitting significant functional work to the executive briefing repository as a matter of routine. I had maintained this practice throughout my 4 years in the role, not as a hedge against suppression, but as a discipline of executive visibility, ensuring that the CEO had access to the work my function produced at the same time it was submitted to the management layer, rather than only when and if the management layer chose to pass it upward. The repository was a mechanism the organisation had built for exactly this purpose. I used it because using it was the right professional practice, not because I anticipated that any particular submission would be suppressed. The framework had been in the repository for 7 months before the CEO looked for it. The fact that it was there when he looked was the consequence of a practice I had maintained consistently across dozens of submissions, almost all of which had travelled upward through normal channels without incident. The value of the practice was not in any single submission, but in the consistency. The CEO could trust that if a document was in the repository, it was there because it had been submitted, not because it had been curated for a particular effect. The gap I acknowledged, not escalating after the second follow-up went unanswered, is worth examining honestly. I had identified at the 4-month mark that the framework was not progressing. I had not used the executive briefing channel to draw the CEO's attention to the stalled implementation. I had absorbed the stall as an institutional reality and waited for circumstances to change. My reasoning at the time was a professional judgment call about organisational relationships. The risk of creating direct conflict with Constance by escalating over her head on a work product she had received. That reasoning was not unreasonable. but it had the effect of extending the period during which the group's succession planning gap remained unaddressed, which had consequences beyond my own professional situation. What I would do differently, and what I now advise people in similar situations to consider, is this. There is a difference between escalating in a way that is adversarial and escalating in a way that is functionally necessary. Going to your manager's manager to complain about your manager is a political act. Drawing a senior leader's attention to a strategic work product that has stalled beyond a reasonable implementation timeline is a professional one. The executive briefing channel existed for the second kind of action. I had used it for submission. I should have also used it, at the 4-month mark, to note that the submission had not moved forward and to ask for guidance on the implementation pathway. That distinction between adversarial escalation and functional escalation is one I think about carefully now in my own practice and in the guidance I give to the people on my team. The succession planning program has completed its first year of the 3-year implementation roadmap. The talent identification process has been completed for the first cohort. 47 individuals across the group's leadership pipeline, assessed against the capability benchmarks in the framework and placed into one of 3 development pathways. The first mentoring and sponsorship pairings are active. The first development pathway programs are underway. The board's Workforce Planning Committee received the program's Year 1 progress report at the most recent meeting. The report was presented jointly by me and the Chief People Officer. The board noted the program's alignment with the succession planning need they had identified 2 years earlier and asked 3 detailed questions about the development pathway design, questions that reflected genuine engagement with the framework's substance. A senior HR business partner who had been in the function throughout the period in question came to me several months into the program's implementation. She had known the framework existed and had known it was not being implemented, and she had not known whether to raise it. She asked me what she should have done. I told her the answer was not simple, because her position in the organisation gave her fewer escalation options than mine, and the professional risk of surfacing a concern about her own function leader's handling of a strategic document was real and not to be minimised. I did not think she had made a wrong choice in not escalating, but I also told her this. The executive briefing repository had been designed partly for situations exactly like the one she was describing. It was a mechanism that allowed people with access to it to ensure that significant work reached senior leadership independently of the management layer. If she ever found herself in a similar situation, aware that significant work was stalled and uncertain whether to surface it through normal channels, submitting a summary of the relevant work to the repository with a factual note on its status was a professional act, not an adversarial one. It would put the information in a place where the CEO could find it, without requiring her to directly accuse anyone of anything. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said she understood the distinction. The second cohort's talent identification process begins next quarter. The framework's methodology is established, and the identification criteria are calibrated from the first cohort's experience. The implementation is on schedule. The work the framework described is the work now being done. That was always the point of it, not the document, but what the document made possible. 62 pages had sat in a repository for 7 months, waiting for the moment when the right person read them. When that moment came, the pages were still there, unchanged, saying exactly what they had always said. That is what a record does when it is created carefully and stored where it can be found.